Hi, I'm Cengiz Turkoğlu, one of the lecturers at Cranfield Safety and Accident Investigation Center. In this presentation, I'd like to talk about my risk culture study and the framework that I developed and a recent idea about the continuous monitoring approach. I hope you find it useful and interesting, and I hope we can collaborate in this subject so that we can shape the debate in the future. So let me start with my agenda first. So I'd like to talk about these four key topics. And let me start with the first one, the human performance and culture. So this was a study that they looked at the literature, and the ultimate question was about how do people define safety culture and safety climate and constructs like that. So in this study, they came across over 100 different definitions of safety culture and safety climate constructs. And out of these, at least over 50 of them are actually related to safety culture. If you look at the actual paper, you'll find out that even the FAA in different departments, they define safety culture with two different definitions. They're not completely different definitions, but people see what safety culture is sometimes differently. So Professor James Reason, and one of the most cited academics in aviation and other safety critical sectors, and in his 1997 book, and he discussed the actual safety culture and its subcomponents. So he talked about just culture first, and sometimes I think there's a bit sort of too much focus on just culture. I'm not trying to undermine the concept, and which is perfectly makes sense. But at the same time, in recent times, people even started discussing not just, but not necessarily fair culture as a different term. And some of the challenges about implementing just culture. In principle, there's nothing wrong with it, but ultimately sometimes can be challenging. But the ultimate idea is if you create an environment that people build trust to the entire system and their leadership and management, ultimately, then we can develop a good reporting culture in the organization. And a good reporting culture will then provide us sufficient data which the organization can investigate and perhaps learn some good lessons out of that. And finally, the last component in his discussion, James Reason talked about the flexible culture. And again, if you look at the whole concept is we can never develop SOPs to cover every eventuality, particularly in a very dynamic environment like aviation. So as a result, the organization sometimes need to provide some flexibility to its frontline operators and their line managers. So my idea originated from this, and actually I thought, despite the fact that it's well known, all of these and well respected concepts, and I just thought that maybe something is lacking there, and perhaps it's time to introduce the risk culture as a different perspective. So, in fact, I came across a few years after I started this study, the concept of risk culture was actually discussed by James Reason in a Royal Aeronautical Society back in mid-2000s. So, just one thing before we go further, again, I keep sort of citing Reason again, but in one of his books, he talked about human error, and he also discussed the fact that there's no one universally agreed definition of error. So what error means can again differ. So, but I like this distinction between the error, which is the unintentional behaviors, and also the risk-taking, which is ultimately a conscious decisions that we make. And we look at the situation and we make judgments and we take an option. Why I like this approach, again, one of the prominent voices, particularly in the United States, is Dave Marks. And again, he had contributed to a roadmap on this concept, mid-2000s. And he categorizes the human behavior in three groups. Clearly, a human error is an inadvertent behavior. At risk, he calls it, as sometimes called risk-taking, and also the reckless behavior. So the way that we try to categorize, and the reason we categorize these differently, because then we have to deal with these outcomes differently. So one thing to note in this whole idea is to note that it would be almost impossible to put lines in this color spectrum at the bottom. As you can see, sometimes what's a human error to somebody that may not necessarily be the case to somebody else. So somebody else might look at it and say, look, this is actually risk-taking. And sometimes it applies to the fuzzy line or non-existent line between the reckless behavior and risk-taking. I'm not saying in every case, but in some cases, this is the challenge that we all face. So there are lots of definitions of just culture. Here's one from IATA quite recently from their reference manual. And if you take some of these words out, and perhaps what they're talking about is an environment that people are very clear about acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and also behavioral choices in line with the organizational values and beliefs that people make. As I mentioned before, the frontline operators and also their line managers, and also the balancing act between the system and the individual accountability. So these are all some challenges that we all face, clearly. In principle, very good, but I think in practice, there are lots of examples that how challenging it can be, not only for frontline operators, but also for the management when they need to make a judgment about an outcome. So before I finish this first section, I'd like to also make reference to another, perhaps not well known in aviation, but certainly in financial and project management world, Dr. David Hilson, and he's written books and articles about the whole concept of culture and risk, and the ABC model, he calls it. And clearly our attitudes inevitably shapes our behaviors, and then behaviors ultimately in a organization or in a nation, then they form the culture. But then inevitably that culture will then have an impact on our attitudes and also our behaviors. So if you then look at it risk specifically, our risk attitude shapes our risky behaviors, and then subsequently we create a risk culture in an organization. And ultimately the risk culture itself feeds back and influences the members of that society, of that organization. So after just briefly covering some of the key elements or key premises about the human performance and culture, now I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of why risk, why culture, and why risk culture. So the first one is, these are all from my website called riskculture.org. And so first of all, the question is why risk? And I think it's fair to say in recent years, as the industry has become better and better, has improved its safety performance, managing safety has become almost managing risk, because we got to a point that achieving more improvements have become more challenging. So this is in fact reflected in ICAO Doc 9422, which was actually almost 15 years ago, I think. It says the safety is increasingly viewed as the management of risk, which is even within the last 10-15 years, the industry has achieved even further improvements in its safety performance. And as we all know, the risk is defined in many cases by ICAO and by many other safety critical industries as the severity and probability, but at the same time, the risk itself is, particularly in financial work, for example, it's viewed as the uncertainty, but it's also opportunity. So if we try to translate this concept in the safety terms, I think, the safety risks can be quite challenging, and in many cases people have to make some tough decisions and judgments, and they can save the day, and they can create opportunities. This doesn't necessarily mean that they need to compromise safety, but at least they can reduce the impact on the operational aspects without compromising safety, and they can hopefully make some risk-sensible decisions, which we will come in a minute. So why culture? Again, I've just chosen here three key well-known names. The Gert Hofstede, you know, he's written, done lots of studies about culture, national, organizational, and he defines culture as the unwritten rules of the social game. And if you consider the aviation, particularly commercial air transport, it is certainly a complex socio-technical systems of systems. So, and I think that definition certainly applies. Herb Kelleher, who passed away last year, I think, and well-known Southwest Airlines and its organizational culture in recent years, I guess, has some challenges, but at the same time, he defines culture as definitionally elusive. Again, going back to the concept of the culture can mean different things to different people. And again, the well-known quote from one of the management gurus of last century is Peter Drucker: "The culture eats strategy for breakfast." So we can have the best business strategy or safety strategy in the world, unless we have a positive culture, buying from people, frontline operators and line managers and the entire organization. It'll be almost impossible to achieve and implement that strategy. So the importance of culture is, I think, well accepted. So why risk culture? Again, I won't read those two quotes, but I think they summarize quite well. And so maybe not well known in aviation, but certainly well respected academics. And but in my view, risk in itself, of course, we do a lot of quantitative aspects of it, particularly from engineering perspective. We quantify risk and we mitigate it by testing and reliability testing and so on. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that the concept of risk, the construct, is itself a subjective one, but it's also a social one. Considering this, I think a common understanding of risk across the entire organization is absolutely essential for its effective management. So I think maybe it's time for us, not only the business world and the financial world, but in the safety domain, I think we also need to introduce the term risk culture and actually focus on it based on some of the lessons learned in the financial world. So let me just take you through what I've done so far and how the risk culture framework was developed. So it's basically grounded on empirical evidence, not only based on my views, but also based on some of the data that I collected from two industry-wide surveys in 2 consecutive years, 2016 and 17. And so these are the two surveys that I conducted through the website and through some basic data collection methods. And it was literally trying to reach out to frontline operators, mainly for pilots and engineers. And so the idea was to, instead of asking them tens of different questions and for them to tick boxes about on a Likert scale and so on, I wanted to hear their stories. I wanted to literally capture their insights and their experiences. So I was just basically asking them two fundamental questions, and maybe with some demographics in the front, and then maybe some sub-questions at the end. But at the same time, the survey focused on two key questions. So acceptable or accepted risks, and also the second one was rejected or unacceptable risks. So the reason why specifically using those words is, in some cases, some people think that they never accept the risk. In fact, it's arguable, but So then I was asking them what would be acceptable to you. Give me your opinion rather than what you experienced. So it was just an attempt to try to capture as many insights as possible. And of course, I was asking some sub-questions about whether people actually made those decisions themselves or collectively in the organization or as a crew. It was only one person's choice and ultimate final decision, or in some cases they did an organizational decision making. And also some part of the survey was asking them some questions about the factors encouraging people to accept and tolerate certain level of risks. So just some examples from that survey very briefly, and the idea that sometimes just like incidents and hazards and occurrences, people are reluctant to report, but in fact in this case nearly half of the people will perfectly share their own insights. In some cases, some of the very risky decisions that they've taken, and because I was also offering them some incentives, and they were even providing some email addresses, not completely open, but not completely anonymous either. So they were reporting the risk decisions that they made confidentially. So I think if we give them that trust, certainly people can probably, they would be more willing to sort of report risks because nothing happened, and there's no bad outcome. There's nothing to worry about being, taking a disciplinary action against them. So I was also asking the question of what about the some of the operational targets that we all know the on-time performance is one of the key drivers in the industry, the way that the airlines operate and other stakeholders as well. And I was asking them these two key questions, that how much some of these targets, organizational targets, can actually impact on them, and how much they can encourage those frontline operators and their line managers to tolerate, to accept certain level of risk. As you can see, I was also trying to make the point that they don't have to agree with this premise, and they may perfectly disagree with it. And some did. But ultimately, 6 out of 10 in the first survey and 7 out of 10 in the second survey certainly agreed or strongly agreed that operational targets, on-time performance, availability, technical dispatch reliability, can actually drive people to make some risky decisions. And I was also asking about the factors encouraging risk-taking, and different factors from media's attitude. Sometimes you hear stories on various aviation portals, and whether they would have an impact on what pilots would do, for example, diversion decisions and so on. Some legal factors about the passenger rights legislation, for example. Some industry level factors that how the industry is evolving and new developments, and also the individual traits. But ultimately, what many people chose, they could have chosen any of these and all of those if necessary, if they wished to. And ultimately, most prominent of these choices were actually the organizational factors. So in other words, the culture in the organization, the safety culture, leadership's attitude towards risk, where people felt that they could encourage people risk-taking, or in other words, they can also discourage them as well, depending on the organization's culture and the leadership's attitude. And I coded all this data. This is just one snapshot from one survey, but because I was mainly focusing on pilots and engineers and their insights and their experiences, and obviously most prominent decisions or categories were actually about diversion and fuel or go-around decisions. I just grouped them all in one. And also about releasing aircraft to service, defects, damages, and so on. But sometimes even the most interesting one doesn't necessarily have to be the most frequent of these categories. There were some other interesting ones, even about management and recruitment process, that who would they employ as a safety manager, and various others. So one thing that I did is, as well as coding these from different perspectives, for example, one of them was the potential outcome. And based on my involvement in various IASA collaborative analysis groups and the regular reviews of both IASA, ICARE and others, and clearly we all know that there are some key accident categories, such as loss of control, in-flight and long-way excursions, in-flight fire, and several others. So I was actually looking at these scenarios and the decisions, the risk decisions that people made, and I was just coding them based on these. That's which one of those sort of a decision somebody made, that what could have had caused in terms of if they hadn't been lucky, if you like, that if they ended up with a bad outcome. Obviously, in almost all of the responses, didn't ended up with anything, not even probably a reportable occurrence. Sometimes they did, but sometimes they didn't. So clearly, there is a link there that we can actually look at which accident categories and actually how people are making decisions which potentially might cause those kind of accident categories. And then quite recently, as I was talking to a captain colleague, and he said to me, well, pilots actually maybe look at it from different perspectives, because they may want to know that these risk decisions, that the examples that you collected, and where those decisions were they made before departure, or were they made during different phases of the flight. So I actually, again, coded all of this, most responses, and trying to present in that way. So I've got examples of these that I'm more than happy to share, and there are presentations available on the website. And finally, the other thing that I was interested in while I was analyzing this data, and it was all qualitative data, there were very little quantitative aspects of it, but I was interested in where people actually make these decisions and how they make them, and influenced by the concept of fast and slow thinking and heuristics and biases and so on. And in some cases, even it wasn't my intention to ask from people the question of sort of aeronautical decision-making examples. Before I didn't specify, because I didn't specify, they then provided some examples of that, such as land or go around decision. In some cases, literally a split-second decision to go around or not. Sometimes in the air. If you think about the example of Hudson River ditching and Moscow cornfield landing, so people, particularly flight crew, may end up making the split-second decisions, and their risk decisions, their trade-offs and their choices. And they do that based on their training, but there's also a lot of heuristics there that they inevitably use. But at the same time, some of these risk decisions can also be basically slow thinking examples, that they have plenty of time and they can ask for more information before they make the final decision, and such as releasing an aircraft to service or not, and so on. So again, we can look at them quite differently, because when it comes to risk, I think one key thing to remember is that the context makes all the difference. So I think in that sense, we need to recognize that it's easy for us to, with hindsight bias, it's easy for us to comment on it, or even try to target people why they made that choice. But we really need to understand the context and why it made sense to them to make that choice at that particular time. So overall, that was a sort of view of these examples that I collected. And subsequently, again, influenced by Sir Charles Haddon Cave, who has obviously conducted an inquiry on Nimrod accident. That was years ago, but it was one of the clearly a milestone in UK military aviation. And later on, not maybe, I think he talks a little bit about in the Nimrod review, but later on he also talked about the concept of four states of man in some of his speeches. So I tried to find some literature on this and even tried to talk to himself, but I couldn't, and I was looking for literature and I wasn't able to find a lot of literature about it either, apart from his speeches. So I'm not sure where the idea originally came from, but certainly that's what I said, coined by Charles Haddon Cave. So he talks about these four states, and or I guess my view is any of us can exhibit to different states in terms of different risks or in terms of different times. So we can sometimes be risk ignorant if, in regard to a specific risk, and we can show a very risk cavalier attitude. And there are some maybe even political examples of that in recent times during the COVID pandemic. And but at the same time, we can be quite risk averse, particularly after an event, after an accident, after an occurrence, after an incident. People literally, and the organizations, become very risk averse. But ultimately, I think the idea is to lead towards a more risk-sensible attitude, where hopefully we have a better understanding of risk, and we can actually protect the organization and the individuals. So the idea behind it is I was looking at criteria, if you like, that sort of, in terms of understanding of risk, as it increases, we can have two choices, or if we don't well understand it, and we can be risk averse. At the same time, the way that we approach it, we can actually protect ourselves better, or we can be exposed. So that was my thinking, but then again, based on my interpretation of Charles Haddon Cave's words, if you like, in some of his speeches. So let me just now take you to the last section of this presentation, which is the concept itself, which is continuous monitoring of risk culture, what it means, and what is unique about it. So there's some text in there, but I think that I call it sort of an innovative approach to organizational culture from a safety and risk perspective. And we all know that in the Kinev Framework, 4 pillars of SMS, and the safety assurance is one element, and also the safety promotion is another one. And as part of these 2 pillars, we try to train, educate people. We do a lot of promotion, but at the same time, as part of our understanding of how can we assure ourselves, we also we're supposed to conduct surveys. And some organizations do it annually, some organizations do it biannually. I don't think there's a hard rule on that. We can do it, and we can do it by asking them tens of different questions about how they find the leadership's attitude or leadership's commitment, or how much they find the reporting process easy or not, or once we start sort of developing a questionnaire for the surveys, we can ask them all kinds of different questions, and we can limit their responses just by ticking boxes, and then do a lot of statistical analysis. And there's even examples of that, which was conducted at an industry level. One of the most comprehensive safety culture studies conducted in Europe as part of Future Sky Safety Program. And over 7,000 pilots responded, and they answered about 50, 60 different questions in 11 different dimensions of safety culture. I'm not completely against that approach, but I think some of the limitations of that approach is in the examples that I was talking about earlier, that there were lots of statistical analysis. And for example, one out of those 50-some questions they answered, the respondents answered, was about that they tolerate or they accept some risks that make them uncomfortable about safety. So, and thankfully, it was only 7% of the respondents actually agreed or strongly agreed on this particular statement, which equates about just over 500 people. But the key point is that despite the fact that we came out with a finding which says over 500 people in Europe who responded to this questionnaire believe or agree or strongly agree that they have to accept risk that makes them feel uncomfortable about safety. If we don't really capture their views and really understand the context and even the narrative, that we have at the moment a known unknown situation. So the key point is that I personally believe that capturing their experiences, of course the numbers matter, but I think that capturing people's experiences and insights can be more valuable, insightful. So my key point is we can, instead of doing this every so often, we can actually introduce a continuous monitoring approach through a risk reporting program, which I actually, in the second survey, I explored this idea and many people found positive approach. So instead of going out to the entire population, we can actually start with a small group of people. We can train them and expect them what we ask them to do. And it would be completely qualitative, no scales at all. And the whole purpose of this approach would be to give the management in the organization leadership an opportunity to reflect on the frontline operators' experiences. So let me just tell you a little bit about what I mean, and this I already mentioned a lot about this, but I think it's fair to say that I'm leaning towards a much more qualitative approach when it comes to we measure or assess the culture in an organizational culture from safety and risk perspective. I think what we should do is we should look at it qualitatively. And I use lots of quotes there, well-known people, and I think trying to measure culture, we've got to be really careful. So where did the idea come from? The idea actually came from this gentleman, Dave Snowden, perhaps not well known in aviation, particularly in safety, and he developed a framework, Kinev, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in one of his speeches, he's got lots of talks and very interesting ones, and on YouTube and other places, other platforms. So in this particular one, he was also talking about how leaders make cultural change through small actions. So if you have time, I'd really recommend that that particular speech. And obviously, I think quite recently just sort of celebrated his 20th year, the Kinev Framework. He discusses as a sort of a sense-making rather than categorization model or framework. So in other words, we're not trying to put organizational people in boxes, but the whole idea is to really people look at the situation, look at the environment that they're operating, and they can believe that they're in a very simple organization. They can sense, categorize, and respond, or they can be in a complicated environment. They can sense, analyze, and respond. But if they're in a complex environment, which many people would argue, not necessarily maybe every organization in commercial air transport domain, but probably most of them would agree that they are operating in a very complex socio-technical systems ecosystem, if you like. So they need to probe, sense, and respond. And then obviously at times we all may end up in a chaotic situation. Anyway, it's not, I mean, I wouldn't do any justice at all to trying to explain, but if you haven't heard about it, certainly I would recommend you to listen to Dave Snowden in various talks and speeches of what the model is about, but lots of comprehensive sort of speeches. So what's interesting about this thing is that they also introduced this concept of different and innovative approach to data collection. So they try collecting data instead of using Likert scales and other forms that are usual traditional forms that many people use. They're just asking the agents in a population to respond to a specific question, but instead of making choices how much they agree or disagree, they're actually in some complex questions. And in this particular one, they're asking, in the event you describe a project objective that mattered most was, and there are 3 things in there: finish on time, stick to budget, and ensure quality. So no one can actually achieve all 3 at the same time. So you have to look at it and say, as a person, as an individual, you may choose that your view actually sits somewhere in this, but somewhere can be exactly at the same distance to each of these 3, which would be in the center, but also it would never be achieving ultimately all of those 3 things. And obviously then, as you look at the example on the right-hand side, as people share their experiences, then you may end up with a picture like that. And then that gives you some idea about how this you can make sense out of this data. A bit quantitatively, but also by clicking on all of those data points, then you can actually see the narrative and see the insight, what those people are just telling you. So one other example is the sliders, for example. If you translate the example in here to production versus protection, as we all know from even the diagrams in ICAO, safety management manual and so on, this dilemma is regularly discussed and debated. So you can argue that you can ask people and say, look, where do you see yourself as an organization? How much you see yourself or your leadership's attitude towards protection or production? Where do you think that they are? And where do you think that you are when you're making decisions? So it's about sort of finding that where they seem comfortable, that where their position is. So now coming back to the framework, that my idea was, obviously this was the initial idea, that sort of maybe organizations as well as individuals, the organizations can also be in any of these states. So the initial idea was maybe we can assess the organization and we can just put a label on it. But I don't think that would help personally, because even if we create a framework and actually we ask some specific questions, and then unless they actually answer all of these questions, yes, and then if we just say, if you can't answer all of them, yes, and then we just stick in a risk ignorant category, and I don't think that's going to be very helpful. And you can argue the same thing, but if you stick them in risk averse category or risk caveat category. And again, it would be also difficult that in some cases, for some risks out there, and some organizations may exhibit a risk ignorant attitude or risk caveat attitude, where for some other risk, they can be perfectly risk sensible. So the purpose of it is not, again, to put a label to an organization or to a department. That's another one, that different departments within an organization, within an airline, can actually exhibit different sort of attitude towards risk. So what happened then is just sort of, I've just separated all of this, and then sort of visually it became like that. And then ultimately, the idea would be, if you're risk ignorant, you're willfully blind. I've got another reference to that. And if you're risk cavalier, and I guess you're exposed, then you can probably have an accident, or your probability of having an accident is quite high. And then if you become too risky, you're going to end up with bankruptcy. And this is, again, referring to ICAO's safety space diagram. And ultimately, what our idea should be to achieve the allowed concept as well as reasonably practicable, and to move the organization to a much more risk-sensible attitude. So there's your avoiding risk blindness. It's basically, I love this clip and also the quote as well. We sometimes think that, you know, no, we're not risk ignorant. But I think if you really want to be true to ourselves, sometimes we may find, not all the time, but sometimes we may find examples of that. We don't want to know about it too much because it's a big can of worms. So I'm not suggesting that we're at the bottom of it, but at the same time, we can still be maybe in risk ignorant category. Again, we don't want to put barriers in that, you know, categorize organizations or individuals. But so this is where then I was playing with all of this visually. And so again, if we go back to sort of the whole idea of putting people in boxes and categorize them, and I thought maybe that those lines doesn't have to be rigid. And Dave Snowden talks a lot about rigid boundaries and them becoming brittle and breaking up. And maybe we should just completely make them not necessarily rigid. But then the idea became like, why don't we just give people a complete, just like those triads, as I was referring to earlier on, why can't we just basically give people a blank space, a rectangle, a complete blank, and we just say to them, look, here's your directions. As you move towards left bottom, you become more risk ignorant. As you move towards left right, you become risk averse. Right down, risk happier, and right up, you become more risk sensible. And obviously, your exposure to risk, according to that, changes. And also, this is whole or based on your understanding of risk, because if you don't understand risk, if you don't analyze it before you assess it, then you can make sometimes risk-averse decisions and so on. Anyway, so that's the whole idea. So the purpose of this whole concept would be the idea that you then give, you obviously need to select people in a population, pilots, engineers, and so on. You need to give them some training, and maybe 1 or 2 hours, no more than that, but explain all of this, the concept behind it, the reasoning behind it. And you need to give them some assurance that why they think. And then ask the question to say, we want you to share your own opinion, your own observations, the risk decisions that you made, or the risk decisions that your colleagues or even your managers made. And then we want you to share them. And obviously this can be confidentially or it can be anonymously. But we need to make sure that people understand the concept. So imagine that we train people and we give them these tools, and it could be, I'm in the process of considering developing an app, for example, to make this much more easy for people to implement the idea. And imagine that we gave all the tools to people, we trained them, and then we asked them, say, for next, as a pilot project, next 3 months or 6 months, and we want you to go out and share some of your insights, some of your experiences. And in a period of time, and they may end up with this was just my example of, this is what it may look like, just like the example of that triad. So, and then we can then easily, with the use of technology and software or app, we may just want to know that what do one of those dots look like. So we can just say, okay, here's one example, a risk cavalier attitude, and I click on the dot, and I just look at it, a risk scenario. The outcome could be mid-air collision, the phase of flight before closing the door, decision making is slow, but then somebody makes a decision to release an aircraft without operating TCAS on an MEL item into an airport surrounded by uncontrolled airspace, whereas there's a recommendation not to do so. No other aircraft was available. Once again, nothing illegal, but reducing a safety margin against normally applied best industry practice. So, and then obviously the factors encouraging risk, passenger compensation, delay codes, statistics, and some mitigation action. There wasn't hardly any. And then you can look at another example. You can just say, okay, I want to see another one. You can then look at, say, this one is this time, the outcome might be loss of control in flight, and the phase of flight is final approach, and decision making is can be both fast and slow, flying through a thunderstorm on final approach, despite small amount of holding fuel and diversion fuel. And factors encouraging such risks, if I've done it before with no consequence. I think this is a typical one, to be honest. Normalization of deviance, isn't it? And mitigation actions, not necessarily any there. And then we can look at another example. We can look at let's have a look at the risk averse example. You just say, okay, I want to see and hear a bit more. So this time, during the first few days of March, sky was overcast and surface temperature 4 degrees. There was light snow forecast to fall. I decided to anti-ice an entire A380, taking a 1 hour, 40-minute delay. This decision was in the disdainful attitude to this decision by both first officer and the engineering support team. So again, the purpose of the idea of this may not necessarily be pointing fingers at the individual and say you made a wrong decision. None of these decisions are deemed to be wrong or right decisions. I hate that term, to be honest. I don't think there isn't a right or wrong decision. Nobody gets in the morning and says, today I'm going to make a wrong decision. People can make better decisions, but we all make a choice, and that decision based on the information available to us. And I think we can make risk-based decisions, and those risk-based decisions can be sometimes more risk-averse, other times more risk-cavalier, and other times more risk-sensible. Hopefully we move away from the risk-ignorant side of things. So again, the idea would be that the organization, both line management and senior management, even safety review board level, not necessarily every single example, but this can be presented in that SRB review meetings, and some interesting examples. So one other example that here that it sits in between a risk averse and risk sensible one, that during a winter time with strong headwinds would lead into discretion of flight duty, and then the captain rejects and accept a low-cost index flight, and then the organization produces a new flight plan with a 26 minutes additional flight time, which was perfectly acceptable to him, but then the organization ends up burning 6 tons of additional fuel. So again, the whole idea would be to reflect on this and have some dialogue and discussion, and if necessary, have some communication to people, or in some cases use some of these scenarios during training to enable people be prepared to make such decisions. Of course, reflecting on the previous examples, it would allow them to make more risk-sensible decisions, despite the fact that people make some slightly different decisions. So before I close, some key takeaways. So first of all, I think while conducting safety culture surveys, asking people tens of questions and asking them to tick some boxes based on Likert scales and so on, how much they agree or disagree with some statements, and then doing the statistical analysis is no doubt has some value, but at the same time, I think they can be very limited in terms of really developing some actionable intelligence, what the management can do. So my personal view is, if you are going to assess or review the culture in your own organization from safety or risk perspective, I think please do consider listening to the frontline operators and their line managers. And we really need to capture their stories, capture their experiences, why it makes sense to them, the way that they behave, the decisions that they make. I think it's a well-known quote nowadays that sort of big data needs thick data. The numbers are good, but let's go beyond the headline statistics. We really need to understand the context, the insight, the experience. And because the context, when it comes to risk, the context makes all the difference. So we really need to capture that, capture those insights, the experiences. So there are presentations on the website about these different risk scenarios. They're not my made up stories. They are the ones that people responded to my 2 consecutive year surveys, the data that I collected from pilots and engineers all around the world. So you can look at some of them and you might just say, well, this would never ever happen in my own organization. And I can understand that, because some of them are, believe it or not, very, very excessive risk-taking examples, decisions and behaviors. And people are actually releasing aircraft to service with a hole under pressure area because of a lightning strike, or they literally, because of a nuisance message, they deactivate an engine fire warning system on an aircraft and they release and they put passengers in. And thankfully, these are very rare events, just like accidents, but unfortunately they are happening. So I guess the question is, because we can't just really draw a line quickly and say this can happen and this can't happen in my own organization. And that's where my whole idea and the question and the concept comes from. Until we ask those frontline operators what kind of risks that they tolerate and they accept, we really don't know what decisions they make. So please take a look at them and try to consider using them for your own training. And I'll ask the question, do I have enough in my training program to cover these scenarios? Just a couple of things before I really close is just one example, the CRM training. If you look at this from the EASA website, going back in about 5 years, the CRM training legislation, regulations, and the guidance material in AMCs were updated. And for example, going back 5 years ago, this wasn't a requirement, but it was a new requirement that was introduced. The CRM training should address hazards and risks identified by the operations management system. So in other words, it's not only the risks in your register, but it's also the risks that people are actually facing on a day-to-day basis. You may argue that they shouldn't be different. Yeah, totally agree. But until we ask those questions to people, instead of just identifying occurrences and hazards, we should also talk about risk more, despite all the connotations negative about risk. Because it will improve our understanding of risk collectively across the organization. And finally, if you look at this from GM6 or FC 2115, it's about CRM, and this is exactly what it's talking about in terms of no-tech behavioral markers and the CRM program. Decision making, and it's talking about problem definition and diagnosis, option generation, risk assessment, and option selection, and the outcome review. So we can, by implementing a continuous monitoring approach of risk culture in an organization through a risk reporting program, we can actually capture a lot more from frontline operators. So once again, thank you for your attention, and if you're still listening to this clip, and I would certainly encourage you to get in touch if you're interested about discussing the ideas, and I would certainly welcome your constructive and critical feedback, and you can just say to me, it's interesting, but these are the barriers to introduce some of these things in my own organization. And I would respect that, but I'd like to hear more so that hopefully we can find some solutions to address those barriers and then hopefully implement this idea and ultimately shape the discussion and debate on safety and risk culture in the future. So once again, please do get in touch. All the contact details are there. And so thank you for listening.